Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Public Policy, where we are starting Section 9, which is all about juvenile justice. So, if you thought that the adult justice system was, different state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction, the juvenile system is even more different state to state and county to county and city to city. And, all these different areas have much, much, much different juvenile justice systems and processes and rules and laws and procedures and all those things. So it's really difficult to talk about juvenile justice in any kind of detailed way because the details vary so much depending on what piece of dirt you're actually talking about. One of the things, though, is that most jurisdictions define being a juvenile as under the age of 18, although not even that is universal. There are some areas where you become an adult at 16 or 17, but it's usually 18. So if you're under the age of 18, you go into the juvenile justice system. If you're over the age of 18, you go into the adult justice system, but not always. One of the other big differences between the adult system and the juvenile system is that the juvenile system is, at least in theory, much more focused on rehabilitation than the adult system. Now, there's some focus on rehabilitation in the adult system, but it is much more of a primary focus in the juvenile justice system, again, at least in theory. How well this actually works out in practice is a matter for debate. And once again, varies very much by jurisdiction and where exactly you're talking about. Now, for juveniles, there are two different kinds of crimes that juveniles can commit. There are delinquent offenses and there are status offenses. Now, status offenses are crimes that youth can commit that are only illegal because they are a youth, right? So, drinking underage and truancy and, being out past curfew, etc., etc. Those are all status offenses. If somebody above the age of 18 did those same things, it'd be perfectly legal. Delinquent offenses are things that are illegal for anybody, vandalism, burglary, etc., etc., and it just happened to be a juvenile that committed the act, right? So you have to distinguish between those status offenses and the delinquent offenses when kind of talking about, what a juvenile is in trouble for, going through the system for. Now, here in the United States, we have always had the defense of youth, okay? And this is something that goes all the way back to even pre-American Revolution. In the 21st century, a lot of states have this. Some states don't. And even among the states that have it, they set the age limit differently. But what the defense of youth basically says is that if a juvenile is under a certain age, there is nothing they can do that can be tried criminally, right? So if the age of even becoming a youth eligible for the juvenile justice system in your state is, say, 10 years old, an 8 or 9-year-old, no matter what they do, they cannot be held criminally liable for that act, right? Their parents might be. They might be held civilly responsible. They might have all kinds of other, legal issues, but they can't be held criminally liable for that act. So in most states, there is some age under which the criminal justice system, whether it's juvenile justice or adult justice, just does not get involved. Again, other systems there might be other legal consequences, but not criminal consequences. Now, the juvenile justice system really started in kind of that late 19th, early 20th century. America was going through a lot of kind of post-Civil War, pre-20th century, World War II style reforms. And in a lot of states, they realized that kind of children were being neglected, children were being not being kept track of. The increased urbanization during this period was resulting in, kind of children being raised a little more kind of free range, if you will. A lot more children having opportunity to get into trouble. This was also where we started having, in many areas, compulsory education for youth. And a lot of that was really good, but a lot of that was also kind of motivated by either classism or racism, right? So it was a lot of kind of rich white people saying, oh, those poor people or those recent immigrants or those minority racial groups, they're not raising their children with proper moral values. So we need to have the state step in and fix this problem that these, these immigrants or these racial minorities just can't raise their children right, obviously, the way we could. So there was a lot of that kind of classism and racism that motivated this, even if kind of on the surface, this whole like concern for, orphans and poor juveniles and juvenile delinquents, like, on the surface, that's a really good thing. But if you look a little deeper, it's a little more problematic, especially when it came to Native American children. But the kind of legal philosophy that they use to justify this creation and expansion of the juvenile justice system was parens patriae, which is a fancy Latin word that I don't remember the exact translation, but it essentially translates to the state as the parent, right? So when parents aren't doing their job as parents, this kind of philosophy says that the state should step in and raise their children for them because they are neglecting their job, right? And that is still kind of the underlying legal philosophy. You'll hear it cited sometimes in juvenile court cases, right? Now, we're going to talk a lot more about the history of juvenile justice, but one of the other kind of big historical events that happened in the field of criminal justice was the kind of late 80s, early 90s moral panic. And if you don't know what a moral panic is, you should Google that because it's an incredibly important concept, both in American history and in criminal justice. But there was a moral panic all about kind of these teenage super predators that these, teenage kids were learning either from video games or from movies or, from their peers and gangs. And, teenagers these days are going to become this, almost mythical, predatory beast that just robs people and has no moral sense, and just we are raising an entire generation of young people that are going to turn into criminals, and murder's going to skyrocket because of all these teenagers these days that are turning into these super predators. And then, of course, crime peaked in the early 90s and has been plummeting ever since. Right? We are at a fraction of both property crime and violent crime as we were when these fears were kind of popular, to the point where, looking back at it, you can see how these, these fears of a super predator were obvious nonsense, whereas at the time they were taken very seriously, and there were lots of laws passed and lots of policies changed because of these fears of these teenage super predators that just never came to be. Another big problem in the juvenile justice system is a huge racial disparity and a huge gender disparity, right? So with racial disparities, you see things like at every step in the process, race plays a role. And children of minority groups, especially Black, Hispanic, and Native American, they're just at each step in the process, children in those groups are just slightly more likely to be arrested, and then slightly more likely to be tried instead of having their charges dropped, and slightly more likely to be found guilty instead of not guilty. So at each step of the process, they face this very small but significant disparity, to where you look at it at the end, and it's something like 4.5 times more African American juveniles are placed into detention than white juveniles, right? So it's a small effect at each step that ends up in a gigantic difference at the end. And with gender, it's kind of, there are lots of ways in which males are more focused upon, especially when it comes to violent crime. But then there's also gender disparity in the other direction, right? And we see this especially with status offenses. So, for instance, young boys are much more likely to run away, but it's young girls that are much more likely to be arrested and sent into the juvenile justice system for running away, even though they run away at far lower rates than the boys do. And this harkens back to kind of a patriarchal view of young women. And there's a whole lecture I could give just on kind of the gender disparity in criminal justice and how it looks. But unfortunately, we don't have that kind of time today. But just know that, especially with status offenses, there is a kind of female-focused gender disparity there. All right, so this is, again, hugely localized. There are, every juvenile justice system around the country runs slightly different than every other one. In general, these are the common things that happen in order, and they're kind of equivalent in the adult world, right? So at the beginning, there's some kind of crime, something happens, some status offense or delinquent offense, and a juvenile either gets arrested by a police officer in the field or gets referred from some outside source. Could be the Department of Children's Services, could be lots of different areas. But somehow this juvenile is sent into the juvenile justice system. At that point, they go through the intake process, which is kind of like booking and that initial kind of figuring out what the heck is going on here that police do in the adult system. In the juvenile system, it's usually a probation officer gets assigned to the juvenile justice system. At that point, there's a decision made about whether to actually kind of charge the juvenile, and in this system, it's called a petition. In the adult system, it would be called an indictment. In the juvenile system, it's called a petition. So if a juvenile gets that petition and is officially kind of sent on in the process, what happens next is called adjudication, which, contrary to what it kind of sounds like, is not the actual trial yet. This is more, the adjudication process is more like pre-trial proceedings. So this is, figuring out everything from venue to doing an investigation of the crime and the age of the child and whether it's their first offense or last offense. Maybe they get diversion at this stage, etc., etc. At some point, very quickly, after the petition comes down and after it enters the adjudication phase, there is a detention hearing. And this is kind of the equivalent of the first appearance for adults. And this is kind of where that whole, for adults, bail is set. For juveniles, we have to decide, are we going to release them to their parents while they're awaiting their equivalent of trial? Are they going to be held in a juvenile detention facility? What's going to happen to them prior to, while this process is ongoing? The kind of equivalent to the adult trial is called the adjudicatory hearing, right? So the adjudication is kind of the entire trial process post-petition and prior to disposition. But the adjudicatory hearing is kind of the equivalent of the trial, right? And this is where there's a judge, no jury. As we'll talk about in the next subsection, there is no right to a jury trial for juveniles. So the judge sits down with the prosecutor, with the defense, does the whole trial equivalent, and kind of figures out whether that juvenile is either guilty or not guilty of the offense they've been petitioned for. And then, of course, if they get found guilty, it goes to disposition or a disposition hearing, which is the equivalent of a sentencing for an adult, where the judge kind of, takes all the facts of the case and the history of the child. And they have a lot more discretion here than judges in the adult system for sentencing. We expect our juvenile judges to really kind of take a personal interest in each case and to have kind of figure out what's really best for the child in each case. But if they do get sentenced to some kind of confinement or some kind of relocation, taken away from their family to put in either a community services program or, formal detention, whatever, they can get out early, just like adults do for good behavior or whatever. So kind of the equivalent to parole in the juvenile justice system is called aftercare, right? So if you've sentenced as a juvenile to 6 months. You get out after, say, 3. Those last 3 months are spent on aftercare, which is, again, kind of the equivalent of parole for adults. Now, again, your jurisdiction might vary a lot with these steps and what they're called and whether they're really equivalent to this part of the adult system or that part of the adult system. This is very much kind of a generalist view of how the process works. We're going to go ahead and take a break. Thank you for watching.